host Jim Aloisi and Fred Salvucci today. These two barely need any introduction. As mentioned, most of the audience probably your prior colleagues or student here. I have to say that we have two Secretary of Transportation with us today. They are legends in the transportation community, right? For me, personally, I feel really my fortune to have them as my teacher, as my colleague, and as my mentors. So after their distinct public services, they come to MIT, continue to share their wisdom with our students. But today, I'm so happy that to invite them to share with all of the audience today beyond the MIT community. Before I invite Jim to start, I want to do a few warm-up exercise, right? First of all, this forum, the norm is everybody contribute one idea in the chat, right? Either a question or a comment. You can start putting your thought even now, right? Either a question or answer. Choose to spend 1 hour, participate actively, right? Secondly, video on, audio off, as much as can, so we can see each other. That's much more engaging process there, right? So I'll start with some exercise. First of all, I'd like to ask you a question on about public transit to this theme. I'm putting a question there, which is, when was your first public transit trip since COVID shut down? Right. I mean, in different parts of the world, of course, the shutdown time is different, but let's get a feeling how quickly we get back to the public transit system there. Right. So 150 people participated. I'll give 10 more seconds. Okay, so I'll end the poll and share the result. Fran, Jim, can you see it? It's the result?
Yeah.
So 24 people returned almost right away, April to June. Then 20% July to December in 2020. Another 18 in last year, first half, 16% last year, and 7%, and 11% have not go back. Right, great, thank you. So that's first question. Second question is a simple frequency of usage of public transit, right? The current frequency of usage from 5 days a week or above, 3, 4, 1, 2 to the less than 1 month. Okay, we'll give 5 more seconds. Okay, 146 people participated. And then here's the result. Let's see, 13% 5 days or more, 18, 12% today, 24. Great, thanks. So last question from me is in the chat. Please type in, what's the public transit system you are using? Right. Also your local city. So I would say Cambridge, Massachusetts, MBTA. Let's get a flavor of the diversity here. Wow, thank you. Essen, SPP, Switzerland. Great, okay, thanks everybody. So now let me pass the floor to Jim Aloisi to start the conversation. Jim, please.
Thank you, Jinhua. And I'm going to share screen. I appreciate you saying that Fred and I are legends. I think the truth is Fred is a legend. My mother would probably have said to me that I'm a legend in my own mind. In any event, thank you for showing up, everyone, for this event. I'm going to begin this my part of the conversation by talking about pattern breaks. Pattern breaks are these events that happen in history that, for better or for worse, have such an outsized impact on the future that they change the way we live, they change the way things happen. So a couple of pattern breaks, I would say Henry Ford's sort of use and invention of the assembly line to put his Model T Fords out and then his other vehicles. You know, the assembly line is sort of conveyor belt with repetitive tasks by workers, not really good for the worker, but really good for making reasonably affordable vehicles at scale. This created the conditions for what I think people call S-curve adoption of the automobile. It created the conditions for rapid adoption of this technology that led, among other things, to the construction of a massive interstate and national publicly funded highway system that is a significant part of our legacy infrastructure today, and the good and bad of which we live with every day. Another more recent and more obvious pattern break, in this movie, there we go, came with 9/11. 9/11 changed permanently how we fly. It changed permanently for many people how we enter and how we protect public buildings and large office buildings, especially in urban areas. So you can think of 9/11 as a pattern break, and obviously you can think of COVID-19 as a pattern break. And I would say COVID-19 has had the effect of accelerating trends and also causing its own new trends. And emerging from the pandemic, I think we remain a little bit unsettled in terms of understanding a few things that are critical to public transportation. One, which we're doing a fair amount of work at MIT on, one of those unsettled matters is the future of work. Where will people work? How will people work? How will that influence commute? If someone thinks they can extract an additional hour or more of what was once lost commuting time into more productive time, they're gonna be more inclined to figure out how not to do that, right? And technology advances that. So the future of work and the future of transportation and public transportation I see as intertwined, right? The pandemic did accelerate trends that were nascent already due to technology advances, but then it layered on its own issues, I think mostly behavioral. And so we find ourselves today I think in a little bit of an inflection point. I wouldn't call it an existential crisis in the literal sense of the term, but I think we're in a period of great disruption and uncertainty that gives us an opportunity to press a conceptual reset button. So what do I mean when I say conceptual reset button? I'll be a little provocative. Before the pandemic, transit service delivery and transit funding, particularly operating expense funding, were a little bit stuck in 20th century mindsets. And they were not capable of adapting quickly to either the needs or the requirements of our century and our new technology-oriented times. Before the pandemic, trends were that transit ridership generally and in many places were in decline, right? Transit ridership was a little bit anemic. Here's a national trend up to 2018, 2 years before the pandemic, showing that in New York. I think there are a lot of things going on then that we tend to forget about today. You know, today, Uber is probably delivering more food to people than people to places, right? But that wasn't true in 2018 or 2019. And transit agencies generally, I think, had a difficult time. Public sector generally has a difficult time adapting quickly and rapidly to changing circumstances. And in those pre-pandemic days, transportation network companies and ride hailing were really taking a chunk out of transit moves in urban environments. So we can't assume that the COVID did everything to transit ridership, but it accelerated trends, right? And so post-pandemic, this is a graphic showing MBTA ridership. You can see the big plummet that occurs at the very beginning of the pandemic, and then you see a gradual return and a gradual plateauing. And so you see how the pandemic accelerated those trends significantly, especially in the very, very short term. And now agencies are seeing ridership plateau a little bit, facing an uncertain future. But in that uncertain future, I would say two things are very certain. One, transit agencies shouldn't be thinking about service delivery as the way they did before the pandemic, nor should they be thinking about how they balance their operating budgets in the same way. This is, by the way, just a different slide of a more constrained period in Massachusetts since last November that shows the point about ridership plateauing. To paraphrase T.S. Eliot, maybe we had the experience but missed the meaning, right? And that's what I want to talk about for the rest of this conversation. Did we have this pattern break experience, but are we missing the meaning of it in terms of what we need to do? And the knowledge and experience that's gained from the past may be right now of limited value if it imposes a rigid pattern of thinking on how we resolve ridership losses, for example, because the pattern is broken. So I want to talk first about service delivery, which I think is highly influenced by the future of work. These slides have been put together by a team that MIT is participating in, led by Stanford, that are doing a longitudinal survey to look at trends, right? So percentage of paid full days work from home, May 2020 to 22, you see how that's sort of leveled off, and it's leveled off at around 30%. You see the people, now it's granular with people who are able to work from home, right, are moving more toward a hybrid model. So what we can learn from this is that the cohort of people who are privileged to be able to work from home are gradually settling into a hybrid where the general trend seems to be 3 days in, 2 days off. And those 2 days off would tend logically to be Mondays and Fridays, but it's not uniform, right? The future of work, why I showed these slides, it's influencing journey patterns. It's influencing not just the commute time, it's making the commute time less peaky. So you still have peaks, but they're not as peaky. So you see the difference between the yellow line, which is 2019 peak, and the blue line, which is last year's peak, right? Less peakiness, but more travel probably spread throughout the day, different journey patterns. And those are the kinds of things when I talk about service delivery that I think need to be taken into account by transit agencies these days, right? Ridership recovery, I think, will depend on transit reliability and frequency and transit connectivity. Frequent all-day service that responds to new journey patterns, right? Utilizing rail assets and intercity rail assets differently. I've been thinking about this a lot in the context of Boston, but I think it may be true elsewhere. That, I apologize, I'm showing you a bus slide, but I'm talking about rail. If you think about redeploying your intercity rail assets so that particularly within an inner core radius, they're functioning as a subway, you can think about providing people with that more frequent all-day service that I think will attract more riders and be more responsive to emerging journey patterns, right? Improving bus frequency by giving bus its own dedicated lane, giving bus traffic signal priority, reducing dwell times can also be very beneficial in attracting more riders. And I think that there are some potential new service and business delivery models that could integrate mobility as a service technologies and providers, microtransit providers, to provide first last mile solutions penetrating metro and urban transit deserts. So service delivery is one issue. The other issue is funding. And there is an operating budget crisis happening across many transit agencies around the country. Why is this? Agencies have done a pretty good job experimenting with a variety of promotions and incentives. Here's a short list of things that have happened in New York, in San Francisco, in Atlanta, where you see a variety of promotional deals designed to attract riders. But ridership nationally is remaining still plateaued, 50, 60% of pre-pandemic levels on average. I saw an article just an hour literally ago from a reporter at Bloomberg City Lab saying that the head of the LA system is now saying, well, their goal is to have back to 100% pre-pandemic by the end of the year. That's pretty ambitious. LA is not comparable, obviously, to much larger systems like New York or Chicago or Boston, but it's an interesting comment that she made. I'd like to learn more about why she thinks that's achievable. But how did we get to this place where operating budgets are precarious? It used to be, before the Reagan administration, that the federal government actually provided funding support for operating budgets. They don't anymore, but they did. And here's an example of that period, pre-Reagan period, federal government providing 25% of operating support for transit agencies. That's not happening now. It hasn't happened for many decades. And it's I think, a big gap in funding that needs to be addressed. I was hoping it would have been addressed in the recent bipartisan bill. It was not. Reliance on fares, I think, needs to be reconsidered by transit agencies, right? Fares are on average around 35% of an agency's operating budget. And that was perhaps sustainable pre-pandemic, but post-pandemic, with ridership not reaching 100% levels anytime soon, I think it's no longer tenable. And if you combine that with free bus proposals that are taking root across the country and here in Boston, I argue that a future of fare revenues at pre-pandemic levels is simply not on offer, and agencies shouldn't think that they can rely on it. And so what does that mean? It means that agencies and their funding sources need to rethink a little bit how much they can rely on fare revenue in the future. What's the right amount? What's the correct fare recovery ratio? I don't think it's anywhere near 30-40% anymore. And then find a stable, permanent, new source of revenue for operating budgets. Here's the MBTA. Right now, this is a recent document. They're at an 18% revenue current fiscal year to date, right? I would say 18-20% is probably where agencies need to be going forward, maximum. And then that difference between that level and where they were before the pandemic needs to be addressed. So I'm gonna stop sharing and move it to Fred. A lot of this is not rocket science. I'll just close by saying fix it first is a very beguiling soundbite in the transportation world. But at its core, when you say fix it first, I think it should mean for agencies having operating budgets that are adequate enough to pay for qualified personnel to perform regular and program maintenance rather than defer those activities to capital projects, and to be able to rehire the staff that's necessary for them to provide the service that will help get riders back. So I've tried to pack a lot in here. I'm happy to answer questions, but I'm going to segue to Fred, who can fill in the blanks and provide his own perspective, and then we're both happy to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you, Jim. Fred, please.
Hi, so first of all, thank you very much Xinhua, for the opportunity to be part of this discussion. And thanks, Jim, for teeing this up. We're dealing with a couple of crises at the same time. And I actually have somewhere in this room an ideogram given to me by Xinhua, because I believe that the Chinese ideogram for crisis is composed of the ideogram for danger and the ideogram for opportunity. I hope that's true. It sets up the situation that I think we find ourselves in, that we have this crisis coming at us, this so-called fiscal cliff that Jim pointed out, coming at us when suddenly the federal money that was provided as pandemic emergency relief, which has enabled all of the transit systems in the United States to continue some level of service. They probably got enough money to continue the amount of service they previously had, but they're very nervous, and conservative, so they tended to cut back service. Of course, doing that drove away still more riders than they had already lost. So there's some questions about that strategy, but that's looking backwards. The fact now is the federal government did step in, did provide emergency funding so that services could be continued, but that money's going to run out, and there's a real crisis coming. If nothing changes, there's going to be tremendous loss in service all over the United States. The good thing, in a weird way, about a crisis of that magnitude is that it may generate the political will to say we can't accept that outcome, so we have to do something differently. So that's the opportunity part of this crisis, that because it's not a crisis just in Boston or just in Los Angeles, it is a crisis all over the United States that's approaching. It's got a pretty clear timeline, and there may be the opportunity to develop the political will for a sustained federal intervention of the kind Jim points to, of having the federal government get back in a serious way into providing operation and maintenance subsidies so that at least the current activity can continue and hopefully grow. So that's the kind of crisis opportunity piece of it. But there are two other aspects that I wanted to talk about a little. One, we tend to think of things as being stable, and tomorrow will be like today, and today was a little bit like yesterday. So let's look at yesterday to figure out what we should do the day after tomorrow. But with public transportation and many public services, we're actually living with a gradually changing reality, which gets punctuated from time to time with some kind of crisis. But there's an underlying pattern that creates a peculiar problem. In services that are provided with high levels that require high levels of labor, if there is not, there's a theory developed by the economist Baumol called Baumol's cost disease. And in those activities that do not improve their productivity, at least at the rate of productivity improvement in the rest of the economy, that means improved productivity more than the rate of inflation, then those activities will eventually be priced out of the market and die. And the only alternative to death is public subsidy. So the question is, there may not be public subsidy, in which case the activity dies. If there's public subsidy, the activity can survive, possibly in a somewhat modified form. From an economist's theoretical point of view, if the activity which is threatened with this demise provides external benefits beyond those that go to the rider, in the case of the transit system, if those external benefits are also growing faster than the rate of inflation, then it's economically justified to provide that subsidy to keep them alive and perhaps even expand them. But our legislatures and Congress are not made up largely of economists named Baumol. They're politicians who respond to what the reality in their districts are. So if you've got a public sector activity like healthcare, if you have a labor-intensive activity like healthcare or teaching, you tend to have a pretty uniform constituency who says, yeah, there are external benefits to this activity. It has to continue, so we'll subsidize it. In the case of public transportation, the beneficiaries are fairly lumpy. There's a lot of public transportation in cities, some cities more than others, but even in a pre-urbanized state, New York or Massachusetts, most of the state is not composed of transit riders. So you may believe that there's an economist's answer that says, yes, these activities should be subsidized because they're providing these external benefits, but you need to be able to translate that into political will. And that means building constituencies who agree that it's worth putting money into it. For public transportation, with this problem of lumpiness, that the beneficiaries tend to be concentrated in a small subset of legislative or congressional districts, it's essential, it has been essential, to develop allies sufficient to provide the subsidy. Often that's been coalitions between transit and road building, contractors, you can fill in the blanks. But without those coalitions, public transportation in the United States would either be dead or substantially smaller than it is. The success of those coalitions in getting public subsidy is what's allowed the situation to be that at least transit is alive. But the point about the Baumol problem is that it keeps getting worse. So tomorrow will not be like yesterday. Now, what other activities are going on that might suggest that transit provides the kind of external benefits that warrant continued subsidy? And can we convince enough constituencies that that's the case? And there we bump into the climate change crisis, which I think we have to recognize as the other very large elephant in the room here. Right now, there's a presumption that we know that the automobile in particular is a very large part of the problem. Because the automobile is so central to mobility, particularly in the United States, the political pressure among those who admit that there's a problem has been to say, let's fix the automobile. The electric vehicle is going to solve this problem. Well, if you think about the time lags involved in people being willing to buy and use electric vehicles, because it is not happening in large amount now, the time lag involved in getting the source of electricity to not be carbon-based, we're talking timelines that are way too long to actually be timely to deal with the problem we have. Professor Haywood from mechanical engineering had a very interesting way of portraying this problem in a conference at MIT at Kresge a few years back. And what he basically said was, there is no silver bullet. If we're going to deal with a problem this big, we're going to need a large number of parallel initiatives acting, each doing their part, and maybe this problem is solvable. Within the John Hayward context, I would argue that transit is one of those building blocks. Like the electric vehicle, it cannot solve this problem all by itself, but it is a significant piece of the solution, I think, especially if we look at COVID and recognize that the threat of COVID has not just been to transit systems. The threat of COVID has been to cities in general. Now, historically, there have been plagues going back to very ancient times. And historically, after plagues, cities come back. My bet is cities are going to come back again. That's where creativity exists. That's where agglomeration benefits occur. That's where the ideas that generate economic growth and sustainability. I think the hope of the planet lies in urbanization and successful urbanization. I don't believe that worldwide the automobile model that is prevalent in the United States is sustainable. It may not be sustainable in the United States. I don't think it's sustainable as a planetary solution. So I think transit plays a very important role, a partial role in the United States. I suspect a larger role in other countries if we want to see the development of successful urbanized areas that can absorb labor from rural areas that are shedding people into cities. And the question is whether those cities are going to be productive or not. So I think transit's got a very important role. That is to say, there are external benefits to public transportation in supporting cities and urban growth. I think within the United States, we could probably identify about 200 metropolitan areas that could be the future of the American economy in a more sustainable way with appropriate public transportation. But before we get into far future, we have to survive the next couple of years. And right now, the coalition needs to be built that says the demise of public transportation as we know it in the United States is not acceptable. And we need federal intervention, particularly on this operation and maintenance side, as Jim pointed out, for the system to survive. The measure that the public will understand of the importance of public transportation is the number of riders we're carrying. So I think it's urgent to get people back into transit, at least at pre-COVID levels. And I'm glad that the mayor of Los Angeles is saying we're going to get there. I think it's really important to be able to show that the systems carry a lot of people. Last point, a little bit of quick math. Jim said that, order of magnitude, less than a third of the operating costs are coming out of fares. That means that more than 2/3 of operating costs are coming from the public sector. And all of the capital is coming in the United States, either from the state or from the federal level. So providing satisfactory answers to those constituencies who are paying for 75% or more of the cost of the system, all of the capital and more than 2/3 of the operating cost, it has to be rooted in the public benefits and growing public benefits that warrant a continued subsidy of a product which will continue to grow in cost probably faster than the rate of inflation. That is, we've got COVID's disease. Beaumont told us there's a remedy for that, but it requires public subsidy and it requires building that political will to support the level of public transportation that we think will be helpful to enough other constituencies that it will generate the political support to conclude that transit should not die within the next 2 years, but ought to be provided at least sufficient support to survive, carry the same number of people, and grow. Anyway, thanks for giving me the chance to put these thoughts out. And happy
Great.
to be part of the discussion.
Great. Thank you so much, Fred and Jim. I will put both of you up here. And in the audience, there's Michael Schiffer is the audience, who is the Senior Vice President from MTA. I want to invite Mike to offer a short remarks in response to Jim and Fred's talk. Mike.
Sure. I don't have anything formal to present, but first of all, Fred and Jim, it's terrific to hear your thoughts and ideas, and I see so many great people on this list. I feel honored to say a couple words. So first of all, have we experienced what Jim would call a pattern break? I think so, but the level of that probably depends on the context of the city that you're in. Some places like Manhattan clearly are physically dependent on high capacity transit. They can't survive without it. It's just physically not possible to fill the office buildings without transit. So high capacity, high quality transit is clearly important and more important in some cities than others. There's no easy answer as you look across the country, clearly. I mean, because the solutions for New York are very different than the solutions for Phoenix, as an example. That said, just in the context that I work in, given our reliance on the agglomeration economy, cities, very, very large cities, seem to be bouncing back pretty well. And in fact, we've seen our peaks come back just over the last few months pretty sharply. So that's good news to a certain extent. That said, we're still at about 60 to 70% of ridership, and that's a big, big problem, right? And that means we need to rethink our funding model. The fiscal cliff is very real, and it's a very craggy bottom. So, going back to Fred's point, really, it's absolutely critical to build constituencies, because you can't do this alone in the transit industry. You need a broad-based constituency to rethink funding models. That's clearly beyond my area of responsibility. I'm focused more on kind of some of the long-term stuff. And you have to keep the lights on, you have to keep the wheels turning, but you also have to think towards the future because we will come to a new reality. And the cities certainly seem to be bouncing back. Might take a while, but in the meantime, we have to get through this. So thanks very much for the opportunity to comment.
Great, thank you, Michael. Yeah, just along with it, I will add one thought, and I will invite Jim and Fred to add it, which is the diverse response for given the similar crisis, right? One factor Mike already touched upon is the population density, right? The different sizes of the city clearly have different thing. But also I want to introduce the cross-culture, the cross-country comparison here, right? For example, in the Asia agencies, even the worst part of the COVID, the notion that public transit will be the core of urban mobility never wavered, right? The city says we will continue. We know it will recover. So we never even challenge this question here, right? Even just about 1 month ago, MIT received a delegation from SNCF, the French intercity company and agency there. We had a conversation of this, right? One thing that struck me, the CEO of the SNCF, they said in the next 10 years, they will plan to double the ridership of the pre-COVID level. They double the ridership. I just don't see this type of ambition in the US discussion here, right? We're talking about rather negative, rather sad situation. But in some part of the world, we have kind of a more positive, this growth mindset on this, right? Maybe I'll add one more thing, and Jim and Fred can add on. It's about the governance issue. Yeah, different agencies, they're really governed in very different ways. The model in Boston versus the model in London, in Hong Kong, they're vastly different, right? How would this governance structure enable or disable certain changes or reform from happening? Yeah, so I'll give it to Jim and Fred.
So thank you, Genoa, and Mike for those comments as well. In terms of the response being diverse, so I look back on what life was like in March, April, May 2020 in the United States. And I think in retrospect, we can say with some honesty, we were dealing with, from a medical perspective, something that was not controllable and largely unknown. We were dealing with, at the time, sort of shambolic federal leadership, to put it politely. And we were dealing with some bad early analyses that suggested that transit somehow was seeding the spread of the coronavirus in places like Manhattan, which we know was just not the case. And there's never been any valid study or data to support transit being a super spreader or a seeder of the virus. So I think all of those things combined made the United States response, and therefore the reaction to transit ridership, what it was. And now when you combine the after effects of that with the technology that allows more people to work from home, with the sense that perhaps productivity is not so bad when people work from home, with a lack, I would say, one of the things that kind of bothers me about this, sort of a lack of any sense of social obligation to have to go to work so you can support a small business economy, so you can promote social cohesion, so you can do all of the things that I think happen when people who don't look like one another come together, right? Those things have been lost. Now, it's not up for a transit agency to solve all those problems, right? That's not the job of the transit agency. But I do think that accounts for some of the diversity of response. Two quick points. Governance, I think, is very important. Here in the United States, there are multiple different forms of governance structures. Some agencies report to state authorities, some to municipal, county. It's a whole blend. I think that we're quickly finding that a governance structure that provides a balance between municipal and state control might be the best approach. The best way, I think, to attract and maintain high quality talent is to try to take a little bit of the politics out of governance. And the way you take a little bit of the politics out of governance may be to have a governance structure that balances out the participation on the board. It's something I've been giving some recent thinking about. And then finally, on Fred's point about building constituency, one of the things that worries me a lot these days is that a natural constituency for transit really ought to be what I would call the climate community, because obviously you want to reduce emissions in part by mode shift. And yet, across the nation, we are putting our carbon emissions reduction eggs all in the transition to electric vehicle basket. You see that happening everywhere. And I don't deny for a minute the power of an electric car to reduce carbon emissions as compared to an internal combustion engine. But I think we need to pay more attention nationally and locally to mode shift and to promoting transit as a part of a short-term solution to reducing emissions. And that there's a constituency there that should be more enthusiastic about mode shift in transit than we currently have.
Thank you, Jim. Fred? You're on mute, Demo.
I think I'm okay now.
Yeah, no, good.
Let me speak a little to the, thanks for all the comments, Mike. It's great to see you again. For those who don't know, Mike and I co-taught the course that Jim is now teaching. So there's a funny link here going on. The point that Genoa makes about the different, much more optimistic attitude from the visitors from SNCF. The United States has been a real laggard in the federal government's involvement in infrastructure. I'm Italian. It sounds like I'm bragging. I'm actually not. But the Romans built a whole network of roads. They did it for evil purposes. It was to exploit the people that they had conquered and engage in the slave trade and do lots of other nasty things. but basically those roads were built to move troops around. Once they were built, people found that they were actually terrific for commerce. So they became very important for public transportation. So it's not a new idea that infrastructure can support economic growth. I mean, we've seen it for a long time. Early in the Republic, in the United States, there was a Swiss engineer named Gallatin who was part of the administration of Thomas Jefferson, who proposed a national network of canals and roads in order to stimulate economic growth all over the United States. The legislation passed the Congress and then was vetoed by Madison. It was vetoed because it was viewed as a threat to slavery, to have a growing industrial sector. Calhoun, Calhoun was a big advocate of slavery in the later part of his career, but he was a big supporter of this infrastructure initiative. There's a whole alternative history to the United States. Had there been that kind of investment that would have allowed the South to be a developed place instead of a slave economy. Didn't happen. You have to go all the way to Lincoln to see another national intervention in the form of the East-West national rail line. And Lincoln was an unusual person. And he also didn't have in the Congress the most conservative element that would have held back the idea. You have to get all the way to President Eisenhower before you see a real intervention in transportation with the interstate highway investment that Eisenhower got through the Congress. And he got it through the Congress. You know, he was a war hero. He had been the general that many people feel was the key person in winning World War II, very high in his popularity. So it took an amazing amount of political will being developed after a couple of hundred years to actually get the United States seriously into infrastructure. It comes much more naturally to the French to think that, well, of course the government should do something about this. I was just in Paris. The subway was coming every 3 minutes. It was like I could have eaten off the floor of the subway. It was spick and span. It was just amazing. It was like, oh, I had forgotten how good it could be. We do have a peculiar problem in the United States, but it's one that has been solvable from time to time. And my hope again is that the very real crisis that these public transportation systems are going to die within the next 2 years if there's not a very significant change in federal policy. In that pessimistic view is an optimistic view that it's not an acceptable outcome, and it will help us to build that constituency to change it, and maybe a little more like France.
Thank you, Fred and Jim. So there are tons of questions in the chat, and I'll give it to John to organize that. Please, John.
Yeah, we have had a remarkably active chat today. So there's no possible way we can get to all of the questions. But let me just start with one. I'm reflecting a little bit on a class that Andrew Salzberg teaches at MIT called Decarbonizing Transportation, where he has articulated these kind of two camps, right? There's the mode shift camp and there's the electric vehicle camp. And both of you gentlemen spoke to that trade-off. I wonder if you had sort of like 10 hypothetical chips of money, time, energy for the United States, how would you split those chips between those two camps, between mode shift and electrification? For example, would you say we really ought to spend all of our time, energy, and money on mode shift and zero on electrification, or would it be some balancing between the two? This is a hypothetical question.
Yeah.
Jim, I'm curious what you think.
Well, I mean, I'm not against electric vehicles. I aspire to own one day. But so I think you have to look at this thing from a time perspective, right? And so there's a value to short-term gains on emissions reduction. Excuse me. And you're not going to get short-term emissions reductions by keeping your fingers crossed and hoping that we can quickly move more people to EVs in this country. And so I do think that the short-term goal on how many chits I would spend.
Let's say you had 10 chips. How many?
Yeah, so
mode shift?
I'd put at least half of them on mode shift in the short term. I would try to invest those chits so I had more to invest later, but I'd put at least half right now in mode shift. And by doing that, I think I would be more in control of my own destiny, because transit agencies at the local level, they can control the investment, well, with the right funding. At the local level, you can control mode shift in a way that you can't control, I don't think, electric vehicle uptake. That relies on too many people across a global chain, right? Too many variables to be able to accurately predict, I think, EV uptake. But you can do something more on mode shift. And so I do think that moving people, and I think this requires at the urban level a reimagining, post-pandemic reimagining of the urban streetscape, which we haven't seen very much of on a national scale. We've seen some of it, but there's nothing in the law that says that a publicly funded street must be for the sole and exclusive use of vehicles to either park or drive. And I think we need to move to a point where we're providing a little bit of a road diet, and we're providing safe and protected lanes for people to cycle, and dedicated bus lanes that would encourage that mode shift and reduce emissions in the short term as we progress in our transition, which I think is inevitable, to electric technology. But I just think it seems to me that electric vehicle transition is a little bit of a shiny object that no one objects to, but that really isn't the short-term solution.
Fred,
And that
your thoughts? Yeah. Thanks, Jim. Fred, your thoughts? Fred, I think you're on mute.
Neither the electric vehicle alone isn't going to move things fast enough, nor will mode shift occur fast enough to solve this problem all by itself. What we're facing now is the perspective of losing the people who are using transit today if we don't deal with this fiscal crisis. So I think there are lots of things that need to happen, and either or discussions are not productive. To me, it's like we got a bunch of people, let's say 10, each of us has a paddle, we're in a big canoe, the canoe is drifting towards a waterfall.
Yeah.
Now we have a choice. We can either hit each other over the head with the paddles saying, no, my solution is the right one. Or you can say, none of us has the whole solution here, but let's work together to get as many of them as possible into motion. That's the coalition we need to build. It needs to include the climate advocates who at the moment are, I think, excessively betting on the electric vehicle in terms of what can be delivered in time. But we need allies, not enemies. So that's my take on it. So I guess if I have to do the chip game, I'd go 5 and 5, but I'd actually take one each, because I think we need the other 8 for the other solutions that are going to be needed.
I also think, by the way, the governor of California just signed into law, I think this week, a law that says there's not going to be any more, no parking requirements for any new housing within a half-mile radius of a transit node. And so if California is hopefully going to continue to lead the nation in this kind of thinking, I think that is the kind of intervention that over time, again, that's not like turning on a switch and things are going to change overnight, but that's exactly the kind of intervention that will support mode shift and the use of more sustainable forms of mobility while we're in this transition to electric.
Excellent. We just have 2 minutes left. I'm wondering, the reference was made to Professor Haywood, and I know that he was on the call with us. Professor Haywood, this concept of there's no silver bullet. If you have any comments, please feel free to jump in on that line of thinking.
Sure. Am I getting through? Yes?
Yes, you are. Wonderful.
All right.
Thanks so much.
What I sometimes say, and I'll say it now, is we are starting a major transition. We don't know or acknowledge how far we've got to go and how big that transition will have to be. And I think we've forgotten that at this stage in a transition, there should be much more, stress the word, exploring of options that make sense. Not every conceivable option, but the ones that really have got at least 1.5 feet on the ground. And I think a key word, particularly for us here at MIT, is we don't need research. We desperately need assessments that try and be as quantitative as they can be. They're going into the future. They're speculative. We're not using our current assessment capabilities, nor expanding them. But that's vital, because how do you choose amongst options if you don't have assessments that are really trying to be usefully quantitative? And useful is another key word I'll underline. Now, there's a lot there, but for God's sake, let's change our mindset.
Great. Yeah. So sorry to cut in here. We're at our mark. So please join me. Thank Jim and Fred for this presentation and conversation. Thank you, everybody.
It's a pleasure.